Hey, what's going on, everybody? Moving forward, gonna be doing a little bit of a response video to the homie Reeves video. He had some very good points. Mine are slightly different, and with nearly 20 years worth of tanking, I figure I just kind of, go over some of his points with my own opinion. He was gracious enough to say that it was cool. So let's get started.
The tank class has been confirmed to be the topic of the upcoming Ashes of Creation January livestream. To me, of any class in an MMO, the tank class is the most important one to get right. The good thing for Intrepid, the Holy Trinity is a tried and true feature of most MMOs, and there are countless good tank examples from previous MMOs that they can borrow from, especially for PvE tanking. Intrepid.
Just real quick, what he said is for the most part true, because tanks set tempo and tone. It doesn't really matter how flashy the other classes look if the tank is limited, like can only grab 3 mobs, well then the combat will be somewhat slow. How powerful the tank is gives you a good idea of how difficult and powerful content is. And considering that Ashes only has one true tank with several variations, it's real important that they get it right and that they get the flow of combat right. And a lot of that begins with the tanks.
Intrepid does not have to reinvent the wheel here, in my opinion, but some small tweaks or innovations would be nice to make the tank class feel unique in Ashes of Creation. What we have seen of the tank in Ashes of Creation Alpha 1 was a pretty standard tanking toolkit. The only real interesting thing we saw was a ranged taunt, which is something I think is nice to see and could be very useful in PvP. I would also like to see a little better presentation of the class compared to the Cleric and Ranger showcases last year. While I did like both of these showcases, I would like to see a few more skills to get a better feel for the class, and better explanations of the skills before showing them. Maybe show the tooltip and then a quick explanation of how it works. With that out of the way, let's talk about a few specific things I would like to see regarding PvE tanking in Ashes of Creation. I would love to see some details about the threat system. We know Ashes is using a fairly standard threat system, but what I would love to know is how easy or hard it will be for a tank to maintain aggro. In most modern MMOs, it has become extremely easy for a tank to hold threat. In my opinion, it is too easy. Now, I don't want it to be incredibly hard for the tank to hold threat either, but having to at least pay attention to threat to some extent does add a natural dynamic to increase the challenge in PvE. I would also like to see some different ways for a tank to maintain threat other than just hitting taunt skills on cooldown or maximizing their DPS rotation. Maybe there could be windows where a boss is weak to a certain damage type, say bleeding, and the tank can apply bleeds during these windows and get a lot of threat built up that way. Or
What he's talking about is like a Sunder from like WoW, and bleeds is just another real type of damage. And because all tank damages has extra threat, dots and bleeds are just continuous kind of damage and it ramps up. So that's in a lot of modern MMOs right now. Although I do agree with them, I'm not sure exactly what he meant there, because unless he just kind of wants dots to kind of do their own thing and kind of give more specialized threat generation. As far as how easy it is nowadays, I can agree with like one caveat. A lot of it is your gearing, because if you're not geared, people will just rip stuff off of you. But yeah, a properly geared tank, for the most part, doesn't have any issues with threat. I also would like to see a little bit more threat management, make sure you're hitting these mobs and telling people kind of like old school WoW where you used to have to kind of mark your targets. Hey, make sure y'all are hitting this one, stuff like that. We really won't know until going forward. Hopefully they show us a little something about that here on Friday during the reveal.
Or maybe there are some phases where taunt skills do not work at all and players really have to watch their threat. Or maybe DPS players have cooldowns that can drop their threat and or give their threat to the tank instead. And probably in some rare cases, maybe
Misdirection.
some threat table resets, or maybe a few encounters where a DPS has to maintain the highest threat in order for a boss to attack the tank. Just some things to occasionally change up the threat system so there is some variety. And to continue with that, I'm curious if Intrepid will give some in-game tells if someone is beginning to pull too much threat. There is not add-on support in Ashes, so having a threat add-on that clearly shows where you stand in terms of threat is not an option. But having maybe some visual or audio clues might be an interesting alternative to that. Somewhat related to this, I would love to see a return to CCing actually mattering in PvE, make the encounters challenging enough that proper CCing is needed to complete the content, at least until players achieve a high enough gear score to outlevel the content. To add to that, I certainly don't want to see groups running into a dungeon, mass pulling, and AoEing everything down. To me, that is not compelling gameplay. I would also like to see multiple weapon builds be viable for tanking. We know that sword and shield will certainly be viable, but it would be nice to see other weapon sets that can adequately tank. They have stated that to be the case in the past, but that is an older quote at this point. It would be nice to see it in game. And it would be nice to see more about the active blocking. It would be nice to see Intrepid commit to whether or not stamina drain will be a part of active blocking or not. I tend to think it should, but hopefully we find out Intrepid's stance this month. In a lot of MMOs,
Yeah, I agree with him. I like two-handed tanking. I like the ability to change gear based on how I want my tank to perform, including weapons. A lot of the games that I've played in the past, like ESO, Final Fantasy, they've had two-handed tanking in them. As long as you can hold and maintain the threat, it should be fine. They've said in the past that they were going to try and allow a lot of differences in weapons and across all classes. So this should be something that we can expect, but again, we won't really know until Friday. Actually, I'll have to do some research. I feel like they mentioned something about it in the cleric showcase because the fighter was technically off tanking with the two-hander, or they might have just said that. But yeah, I for the most part I agree with him here. Just give more versatility to the tanks since there's only one true tank and a bunch of off tanks and a bunch of variations of the one real tank. Let them staff tank if they want to, dagger tank if they want to. Um, I think that'll just kind of spice it up and keep it more interesting for the people that play that class.
there's a shortage of tanks. I would love to see some of what Intrepid has in mind to address this shortage. We do know that the group size in Ashes of Creation is 8 players, so if encounters are designed for 8-man groups, that will absolutely help with the tank shortage, as the DPS to tank ratio is higher than most MMOs. I would also like to see, even in raids, for only one tank to be required, with maybe some encounters needing off tanks. This again helps with the tank shortage. We know that the tank primary are
And this is probably where a lot of my narration is going to come. You have to understand why there's a tank shortage to address the issue. Making it easier to have less tanks be required to do content doesn't help the shortage. In theory, it does, but if tanking just feels bad, which is usually the case, a lot of times tanks are just severely limited in one way or another. Like trash at PvP, and then PvP is a pretty decent part of the game, or they're not fun. It's hard to clear with them because they don't do enough damage, but they don't die. It's a hard balance to kind of get. But if the tank is fun and the tank is powerful, you won't have a shortage of tanks. You'll have a shortage of good tanks because there will be people that play it. Off tank is where they can address a lot of the sub level tanking shortage issues, but I believe it should be differently. I believe raids should take a lot of tanks and off tanks. You need to have tanks needed in more places, and you need the tank to be strong and powerful so people want to play it. Off tanks should be able to do easy open world content. You want to go grind mobs, you should be all right with an off tank or two. You shouldn't have to have an actual tank. I'll probably speak about it later on in the video about what I think the differences between off tank and tank should be. But essentially, one should be turbo boosted up as far as abilities and support systems around tanking, whereas one should just be able to grab hold mobs.
Archetype is the only class that can be the main tank in groups. I would like to see those primary archetypes that choose tank as their secondary be able to fill that off-tank role as well. I hope that is the case, and I also hope that they don't have that many encounters that require off-tanks. Another issue with tanks in MMOs is leveling. Tanks typically have very low damage, so leveling solo is very difficult. In some MMOs, tanks can farm dungeons to level, but we don't know how viable that will be in Ashes. And quickly changing specs is not an option for tanks in Ashes. The only way to change specs is at a village stage node or higher. So in theory, a tank could switch between DPS and tank specs as needed, but with the size of the world, that might not always be viable. So one solution I thought of is a buff that increases the damage of a tank spec when they're solo PvEing, not in PvP or when the tank is in a group. And to get around groups trying to remove the tank from the party to boost his damage.
This is how you normally balance this. Is you put the tank's damage just under a certain point. I can't give you something exactly, but their durability is crazy. So how you do it is the tank can grab 3 things and then burn them down at the pace roughly that a damage player can kill 3 things one at a time. And that's where you find the balance. WoW's done a really good job of this. Final Fantasy's done a really good job of this. Like I can grab a bunch of stuff and I can attack it, and then there's a group tag and everybody tags it, and then everybody's getting credit and XP, and then we just kind of move on. It's not a matter of boosting their damage and stuff like that. It's not that I think it's a bad idea. I just don't necessarily think that it's needed. I'd rather it just be balanced properly, but that's a whole different kind of story, possibly different video going down the road with how Intrepid and the Ashes of Creation crew intend on balancing their game.
Make it so the tank can't hold aggro from the other players very well without being in their party, or make it so the tank can't receive heals when they have the damage buff active for being solo. This would alleviate one of the potential.
Yeah, I'm not crazy about that. I don't think that should be a thing. I think everybody tagging everything within a certain amount of damage should get credit. It kind of limits player interaction and group play more than it would help.
Pain points for tanks and hopefully increase the tank population. So those are all my thoughts on ways to make PvE tanks more interesting while still fitting in a standard tanking model we have seen work in MMOs time and time again. But what about PvP? Well, the consensus of the MMO community seems to be that tanks are often bad or useless in PvP. To that I say that might be the case in a lot of MMOs, certainly the most popular ones like WoW, but there have been a few MMOs that bucked that trend in a very big way that Ashes can borrow from. To me, the MMO that did PvP tanking the best, without question, was Warhammer Online. In Warhammer Online, there were several skills that made tanks function extremely well in PvP. The first skill that all tanks had was called Guard. A tank can place this on an ally, and the damage that the ally takes is split with the tank as long as the tank remains within 30 feet of this ally. This was a great support skill and could allow a melee DPS to engage in a fight when otherwise it would not be possible. The next key ability that all tanks possessed was called Hold the Line. This skill would increase the tank's dodge chance by 45%. More importantly, it also provides a 15% chance to dodge for allies behind the tank and within 50 feet. This 15% could stack 3 times as long as the ally remained positioned in range of the tank and the tank kept channeling the ability. This is a great positional way that a tank can provide protection for their team. And interestingly, it seems somewhat similar to what Steven hinted at in the October livestream for a new tank skill that they are working on. I imagine this skill could potentially be a modernized version of Hold the Line from Warhammer Online. Or it could be similar to the Guild Wars 2 Guardian skill Wall of Reflection, which was simply a wall that the player could cast and all projectiles that hit the wall get reflected back to the caster. So the first thing I think a tank needs in PvP is to be someone that can provide dynamic group-wide shielding, whether through the dodge stat like in Warhammer Online or through an active wall that is positioned to reflect.
I never played Warhammer, so I can't really comment on any of his opinions or coverage of Warhammer. But I did play a lot of Guild Wars 2 and thousands of hours of ESO. ESO kind of booked the Trinity a little bit, but they did PvP tank probably better than even what I'm seeing right now. And guard is a skill that's in countless games. It's a good skill. Hold the line in one variation or another has been in a lot of other games, usually like a PvE spell, but could definitely be put into the PvP side. I agree there needs to be a lot of mitigation of damage and damage soak opportunities for tanks, but not so much so that it can be gamey or that it can be used to kind of cheese things. Yeah, that's pretty much it. We can go on with the video. It's just tanks in general should kind of be buff and mitigation in PvP, and they should have enough damage to where you have to respect them. Not enough damage to where they're just gonna like burst people down, but they need to have enough damage that you get caught lacking and you're out there, or you're taunting, or you're being silly, and he hooks you and he bangs on you. They should be able to blow you up. Like they should be able to like get you if you are disrespectful, you know. But they don't need enough to where they can just dive into groups and like survive and do all of that. It's probably a pretty difficult situation to balance overall. How ESO did it is you pretty much tank with your abilities. They have the Dragon Knight, and they got what you call flappy wings. I forget what the actual ability is. This is a quick video, no fancy editing or anything. But essentially, whenever you hit that button, you get a shield and you flap your wings, and then anything that hits you reflects back. So kind of like a wall of reflection. Then there's different kind of buffs, bombs, AoEs, roots, and stuns. The roots and stuns are really, really important in ESO. So how I would build the tank, which I think he's going to get on later, that based on what other classes that the tank takes, you just get different variations of your stuns and your immobiles, and you buff people, you mitigate damage. You essentially kind of, more so than a tank, you kind of evolve into a tank / support character when you're kind of supporting in PvP. And if you're providing X amount of support and doing X amount of things, you will get attacked more, which then benefits your party.
Projectiles like in Guild Wars 2. After that, tanks should be disruptors. They should have access to a lot of CC. They should have the ability to apply annoying debuffs like a healing reduction. They should be able to remove buffs from enemies. And again, Warhammer Online had this in spades. If you look at the Return of Reckoning career builder page and start scrolling through the skills, you see a ton of CCs and interrupts for the tanks. You also see a skill that essentially kicks enemies away. This kick could send someone a long ways away and put that player into the heart of your team, so they would very likely die. However, a tank would have to get within melee range of enemies and get in the correct directional position to pull this off. This allows for counterplay by the opponent. A lot of MMOs use a pull type of ability to pull enemies closer to you. This is something we saw in the Alpha 1 tank with the Javelin skill. I would like to see a combination of the two for the tank. A Javelin pull but have a shorter range than the kick. Then the kick skill potentially has a huge range if the tank has enough mana or energy, but the trade-off is the tank has to be in the thick of things to get within melee range and be positioned correctly. Further expanding upon the role of tanks in PvP is the idea of taunts. Again, Warhammer Online did this well. There are two main taunts that tanks had. The first one was simply called Taunt and would increase the damage that target took from the tank by 30% for 15 seconds or until the target attacked the tank 3 times. This allowed for smart counterplay and gave the taunt a viable use in PvP. The next taunt was called Challenge. This was an AoE taunt that would cause opponents to do 70% of their normal damage to everyone except the tank, and again it lasted for 15 seconds or until the enemies hit you 3 times. This again forces the enemy to attack the tank or deal reduced damage for a significant amount of time. I have also seen other games use a taunt as a simple CC where it forces the enemy to do basic attacks to the tank for a few seconds. This might also be a third type of taunt the tank could have in PvP. Also in Warhammer Online we saw body blocking as player collision was a thing. This is also something that Ashes of Creation is planning to have, and while I think player collision can cause problems in nodes and should be turned off there, in PvP it opens up a lot of potential for interesting gameplay. Tanks physically blocking choke points or surrounding and singling out an enemy target are possible. On top of body blocking in Ashes, we are also going to have projectile collision. This means tanks have a role in the fight as the frontline defender, shielding their ranged DPS and healers from projectiles. So those are the lessons we can take from Warhammer Online on PvP tanking. What are some other ideas? Well, one thought I have is an aura type of ability that buffs allies. Perhaps the best example of this I have seen is from a game that no longer exists called Forge. In that game, the tank class had an ability called Vengeance that would give vengeance stacks based on the amount of enemies that are within melee range. So the more enemies around you, the faster you would gain stacks. So this encouraged the tank to be in the fight to get these stacks. With these vengeance stacks, the tank could activate one of 2 auras. Only one could be active at a time. One aura would increase allied movement speed and damage. The other would increase allied health and armor. These auras would be stronger the more stacks of vengeance the tank had. The auras did require upkeep as they would drain energy over time, so the tank would have to actively use builder skills to maintain enough energy to keep the aura active. And of course allies would have to be in range of the aura to get the benefit of it. This is similar to the type of aura system I think would be great for Ashes of Creation. One change I would make is limiting how many vengeance stacks the tank could get. In Forge it was very high and could make the tank and allies unkillable if they got enough stacks. It would also allow some counterplay by the enemy team. The goal of a PvP tank is to be the target, but they are also very hard to kill. So what I would do is reduce vengeance stacks if the tank was taken below a health threshold. So you could remove half the stacks below 50% and 75% of the stacks below 25% health. This would allow some counterplay by the enemy team that does not require the tank to be completely killed. Further ideas I have for the PvP tank in Ashes of Creation is perhaps a damage buff that slowly builds the longer the tank is engaged in PvP combat and remains above a health threshold. It would stack to 5 stacks but reset to 0 stacks if the tank is taken below 50% health. This could be a further reason for the enemy team to want to attack the tank in PvP. Finally, for the tank, it would be nice to see the PvE and PvP builds work together. So if a tank has built specifically for PvE encounters, that build is also at least somewhat viable in PvP. With not being able to quickly change specs on the fly, I think having builds that work in a PvX manner is important. And for further ideas, Intrepid could look at MOBA.
Yeah, the ideas he had for the taunt, I like them. That's just pretty easy. I like them. I also like the auras. I'm not sure how I would do them. His ideas sound pretty reasonable and pretty solid. That should be something they have to build into. That shouldn't. A lot of the things that he's talking about in this video and that I've talked about in this video, I would like for tanks to specifically have to kind of like build into. I don't know if I want a lot of these things in their base kit, because then they sound kind of broken. I'd want you to have to be able to build one way or another. As far as the gear goes, I feel like that's kind of a given. The game is PvX leaning PvP. I feel like all gear is going to be relevant in PvP. I don't know if there'll be like specific PvP stats or this, that, and the other. I guess what he's trying to say is stat weights. Maybe you need a certain kind of stat to have a certain ability that's really good in PvP, do really, really well, but you would never use it in PvE. So if you've built yourself that way, it wouldn't be viable. I don't know if that'll be a thing. How it seems to me that Intrepid is building their game is that it's a PvP game with PvE mixed into it. And so it just seems like all the gear should be pretty relevant as far as combat and stuff goes. There's just a little bit left. I'm going to go ahead and let it finish.
And games like Overwatch. Yes, they are in different genres, but they both were able to make PvP tanking work and could provide further ideas to expand upon. And that concludes my thoughts on what I would like to see for the tank in Ashes of Creation. We will get some idea of what the tank is this month, and I will do a breakdown of it just as I did for the Melee Showcase and the Ranger and Cleric Showcase. Thanks for watching, consider subscribing if you haven't, and I will see you in the next video.
Subscribe, and hit the like button and all of that. I appreciate everybody took the time to listen to this. Y'all take it easy.